In San Francisco, on African Liberation Day, Brother Walter Rodney, an African historian, noted both the importance of African Liberation Day in terms of our African identity and some of the root causes for our problem of identification.
I have met brothers and sisters who say that their mother tongue, quote unquote, is French, Spanish, Dutch, Portuguese, as well as English, which we speak. And because of this, we have a problem of identification. We do not know whom we are. And that is why this gathering is of great symbolic importance, because it is an act of identification. We are saying that we identify with the African people of the African continent. We are saying that we are an African people. And when we make this identification, have no illusions about the fact that this is a very revolutionary initiative. It is a rejection of every other form of identification which the white society has asked us to accept. Let me draw your attention to something which white universities and white libraries practice. And this is a university community. Numerous universities lie around this land. You go into their libraries and check the Library of Congress cards. Under Europe or European, you will find all entries listed concerning the continent of Europe. You will also find entries listed about Europeans in East Africa, Europeans in North Africa, Europeans in Asia and Australia. Look under the Chinese, you will find entries listed not only for mainland China, but for Malaysia and for the Chinese in North America. But look on the Africa and the Africans, the only entries on the Africans relate to the continent itself. There are no entries on the Africans overseas. There is no such category. Africans who have been raped from the continent mysteriously disappear and become Negroes.
What's good, everybody? This is Ramiro from ANTICONQUISTA. ANTICONQUISTA is an anti-imperialist media collective. Our content is produced by and for the Latin American and Caribbean diaspora. And today is political education session number 12, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by the great Walter Rodney. We just heard from Walter Rodney in the beginning, speaking at an African Liberation Day event in San Francisco, providing a revolutionary Pan-Africanist, socialist, anti-imperialist perspective on education, on academia. I come from academia. I know how whitewashed and racist and imperialist academia can be. And Walter Rodney is somebody we have to be studying, we have to be learning from. And that's who we're going to be speaking about today. Shout out to John Rivera in the chat, to everybody watching and listening. Shout out to everybody in the Anticonquista familia. And today I'm honored to be joined by comrade Erica Caines, who is a poet, writer, organizer in Baltimore and DMV area. She's an organizing committee member of the Anti-War Coalition, the Black Alliance for Peace, as well as an outreach member for the Black-centered Ujima People's Progress Party. Shout out to them. Erica founded Liberation Through Reading in 2017 as a way to provide Black children with books that represent them. How's it going out there in Baltimore, Erica?
It's going.
Good, good. I love your hair, by the way. I was telling you before we started the stream that it looks so amazing.
Thank you. I know since the last time it wasn't threaded, but now it is.
That's what's up.
So thank you.
Cool. And we also got comrade Ezra with Red Condor Collective and Anticonquista based in Bogota. How's it going, Ezra?
Yeah, it's going pretty good, thanks.
Cool. And we got the one, the only comrade Nick Ayala, co-editor of Anticonquista, representing Newark, New Jersey. How's it going, Nick?
Good, man. I'm excited to be here with comrades Erica and Ezra. Excited to get this talk going on. I really like Walter Rodney's work. You know, it's really pivotal and inspirational, I think.
Yeah, most definitely. And Walter Rodney is somebody who we at Anticonquista study very closely, because the stuff that Walter Rodney is talking about having anti-colonial movements at the center of the socialist movement, having African, Asian, and Latin American people determine their own destiny, is the sort of socialism that we promote and support, and we have seen throughout history has been the most successful. I think a lot of people on the historical white left, the European left, have neglected Walter Rodney because he's not immediately talking about all workers of the world unite, everybody's equal from Germany to Africa. He's saying that there's a very clear division between Europe and Africa, and that the wealth and resources of Europe are based completely on the plundering, the colonization of Africa, which, in my opinion, is one of the most wealthiest resource-rich continents in the world, that united and together can be powerful, can be strong, and is more powerful than Europe. But unfortunately, because of colonization, because of imperialism, that continent has been kept oppressed, marginalized, colonized. And so Walter Rodney's work is really inspiring because it provides a blueprint for peoples all over the global south, not just Africa, but in Latin America and Asia, to stand up, to fight against Eurocentrism, to fight against racism, and to understand the economic foundations of development. One of the things that, as a child of immigrants, I frequently hear and have heard from my own family are people saying that, you know, why can't our countries be like the US? Why can't we have the skyscrapers? Why can't we have all of the restaurants? And Walter Rodney does a great job in this work of explaining the dialectical relationship between development and underdevelopment. And they're two sides of the same coin. Everybody in the world can't be billionaires. The wealth of a continent like Europe is based on the plundering and oppression of a continent like Africa. And so that's what we're going to be jumping into. Before we actually read some excerpts from this work, again, this is How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, published in 1973 by Walter Rodney. It was written in 1972. Walter Rodney was born 1942, March 23rd, with roots in Guyana. Shout out to Guyana in South America. He was a political activist, academic. He was born into a working class family. He attended the University College of the West Indies in 1960 and was awarded a first-class honors degree in history in 1963. He earned a PhD in African history in 1966 at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, England, at the age of 24. And his dissertation focused on the trading of enslaved people in the Upper Guinea Coast, and was published by Oxford University Press in 1970. Unfortunately, in 1980, he was assassinated in Georgetown, Guyana. He was 38 years old by a bomb in his car a month after returning from celebrations during the independence in Zimbabwe. And this was a time of intense political activism. You know, let's keep in mind the context, right? The year that this book was published, 1973, was the year of the U.S. coup in Chile that overthrew Salvador Allende. This was an era of neoliberalism on the offensive, of the racist white supremacist movements all over Africa and Latin America taking back power. We also have the liberation movements across Africa and Zimbabwe and Angola. So he was writing at a time when there was he wasn't just chilling on a desk, you know, isolated from the struggle. He was actually involved in the struggle. He was very active in these movements, frequently traveled across Africa and also the UK and the US. So this is somebody who is combining theory and practice. And again, this book was written in 1972, published in 1973. And he explains how Africa was deliberately exploited and underdeveloped by European colonial regimes. One of the main arguments in the book is that Africa developed, is the fact that Europe developed economically at the same time that Africa was being underdeveloped because of that dialectical relationship. And so there are 6 chapters in this book. We're only going to read excerpts from 3. This is a very well drawn out book, plenty of pages. Chapter 1 is Some Questions on Development, where he explains development and underdevelopment. Chapter 2, How Africa Developed Before the Coming of the Europeans up to the 15th century. And we're going to start off with Chapter 3, Africa's Contribution to European Capitalist Development, the Pre-Colonial Period. Before we actually jump into talking about Walter Rodney and reading excerpts from the book, I just want to get some analysis from the comrades on the stream now, starting off with Comrade Erica, about why Walter Rodney is important and why we should all be studying him.
Yeah, so I want to thank you for having me on and inviting me to come on. You might hear my 5-year-old in the background.
It's all good.
Yeah, so Walter Rodney, I was introduced actually to Walter Rodney through my comrade, Devin Springer. They work with the Walter Rodney Foundation, and they also host the Groundings podcast. And as you know, Groundings is the name of Walter Rodney's book. Groundings with my brother. When I learned of Walter Rodney, it was around the same time that BAP was running the Black Alliance for Peace was running the U.S. out of Africa shutdown AFRICOM campaign. We were just starting to get underway with that campaign. So my book club that I have called Liberation Through Reading BC is one that I have online, which we actually have tonight after this. I thought the idea of, well, why not read this book so that people would understand why we need to shut down AFRICOM and why it's important, and just the development of Africa and what the U.S. is actually doing there. And the book is so well written, and it's also very funny. I think he takes shots. He takes a lot of shots. But it was so well written, and I always suggest this book is understanding settler colonialism. I always say, read Settlers, but read Walter Rodney as well. But now I'm also adding Gerald Horne to that list, The Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism, because I think that those three coupled, you really, really get a sense of understanding of what settler colonialism is and how it has played out. But Walter Rodney, I think, is a significant figure. His assassination notwithstanding, another way that I've also been introduced to him is with his essay on George Jackson, and just his ability to tie in political prisoners with the African colonization and just the whole global African liberation movement, and how important George Jackson was to that movement. So I think that he is an incredible, underrated and understudied scholar. And I think to his significance, what he's written on the Russian Revolution has really helped me understand the Russian Revolution, and has really made me push forward to read more Lenin, to read more Marx. So I think that, he's a very, very important leftist, if you will, Marxist-Leninist specifically.
That's what's up. And Comrade Ramir Shaka Balagun said he got that sarcastic West Indian humor. I love my West. Shout out to all my West Indians, by the way, all my Guyanese people, my Trinis. I grew up in New York around Guyanese and Trinis, working class, hardworking people, loving people. All of the Guyanese people I met have been like family to me, and Walter Rodney was somebody who had that West Indian humor for sure. Shout out to Comrade James, Graham, and John Rivera. Comrade Ezra, I know you've read this work before, or at least parts of it. What do you think about Walter Rodney? Hold on, let me unmute you. 1 second. All right. There you go.
Okay, sorry. So yeah, I've read this before, and I've also read Walter Rodney, A Third World Perspective on the Russian Revolution. And yeah, for me, like, also that was a really great work into understanding the Russian Revolution. And I was actually reading that when there were like protests going on in Bogota, like massive protests, like some of the biggest like the city had seen. And I was really like tying a lot of ties to that. And so for me, like, it's just like really inspiring work. And Walter Rodney is one of those people who, it's not just like, oh, it's like good to read, but he like is enjoyable to read. Like I really enjoy reading him. And he like really like sets it out quite well. And I think it's like really like important in understanding like Africa, like how it is now, like the whole like discourse around it, like Africa needs to like go and be saved. And this like discourse around like, let's go and like have charities and like development, when the problem is colonialism, imperialism, how these like structures still are there and like continue. So yeah, I think he's really like important work for everyone to read.
Most stuff. What about you, Comrade Nick?
Yeah, I mean, I think Comrade Erica and Comrade Ezra really touched on a lot of the important parts of why Walter Rodney is so important in a lot of his works. To be honest, I never even knew Walter Rodney wrote something about George Jackson. I'd be interested to learn more about that. But you know, one of the reasons why I've always been kind of inspired by Walter Rodney was, one, he's Guyanese, right? So he's West Indian. He's from Latin America. Sometimes we in Latin America, sometimes we leave out West Indians and West Indian nations. So it's important to center our work around that, because there's so many revolutionaries there. And not only is he from West India, which is essentially Latin American, but he focuses on his African roots, and he centers his whole work around Africa and really like the ancestral homeland. And by doing such a deep analysis of that, you know, it really, I think it means something when you have an African person who is an intellectual, who is delving deep into their ancestry and doing it with the intention of trying to benefit the people back in the ancestral homeland. I mean, that's something amazing and inspirational that we can all take away from. Because, you know, we could read like book after book of all these white intellectuals who go to Latin America or Africa or Asia and talk about the conditions there. And, you know, sometimes they do good analyses, sometimes not. But when it's a person from the homeland actually talking about it, that's a whole new level of like admiration. And the things that he was writing at the time was risking his own life, right? So he was doing this work knowing that it was that the conditions for it was his life, was a risk of his life. So, you know, this wasn't just any old writing, like academic writing or some writing for like university. This was writing for the people, for the masses, and with the benefit of the masses. So, you know, that's why I think for me, all his writings, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, and I read my groundings with my brothers, those two, you know, for me were really inspirational, especially just knowing the background of the author, who Walter Rodney was and how he came to be, you know?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I'm sure we're all tired of seeing the same old white British dude in every documentary about Africa. It's like, we're here in Namibia discovering the lost secret. And it's just like, yo, like, it's so fucking annoying to see that over and over. And it's cool to see African talking about Africa. And it's really inspiring. And it's funny, we were talking about this in the chat, in the group chat for ANTICONQUISTA. Shout out to everybody with ANTICONQUISTA, by the way, all the comrades. We were talking about how we should have a version of this for Latin America. And it's very true. We need something like this. And this is something that we can study and use as a model and apply for Latin America. So let's just jump right into it. We're going to go to chapter 3. Again, this is How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. This is section 3.1, How Europe Became the Dominant Section of a Worldwide Trade System. So Walter says, quote, because of the superficiality of many of the approaches to, quote, underdevelopment, and because of resulting misconceptions, it is necessary to re-emphasize that development and underdevelopment are not only comparative terms, but they also have a dialectical relationship to one another. That is to say, the two help produce each other by interaction. Western Europe and Africa had a relationship which ensured the transfer of wealth from Africa to Europe. The transfer was possible only after trade became truly international. And that takes one back to the late 15th century, when Africa and Europe were drawn into common relations for the first time, along with Asia and the Americas. The developed and underdeveloped parts of the present capitalist section of the world have been in continuous contact 4.5 centuries. The contention here is that over that period, Africa helped to develop Western Europe in the same proportion as Western Europe helped to develop Africa. The first thing about the internationalization of trade in the 15th century was that the Europeans took the initiative and went to other parts of the world. No Chinese boats reached Europe, and if any African canoes reached the Americas, as is sometimes maintained, they did not establish two-way links. What was called international trade was nothing but the extension overseas of European interest. The strategy behind international trade and the production that supported it was firmly in European hands, and specifically in the hands of the seagoing nations from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. They owned and directed the great majority of the world's seagoing vessels, and they controlled the financing of the trade between 4 continents. Africans, a little clue as to the tricontinental links between Africa, Europe, and the Americas. Europe had a monopoly of knowledge about the international exchange system seen as a whole. For Western Europe was the only sector capable of viewing the system as a whole. Europeans used the superiority of their ships and cannon to gain control of all the world's waterways, starting with the Western Mediterranean and the Atlantic coast of North Africa. From 1415, when the Portuguese captured Ceuta near Gibraltar, they maintained the offensive against the Maghreb. Within the next 60 years, they seized ports such as Arzila, El Sar, excuse me if I'm butchering the names, and Tangier, and fortified them. By the second half of the 15th century, the Portuguese controlled the Atlantic coast of Morocco and used its economic and strategic advantages to prepare for further navigations, which eventually carried their ships round the Cape of Good Hope in 1492. After reaching the Indian Ocean, the Portuguese sought with some success to replace Arabs as the merchants who tied East Africa to India and the rest of Asia. The 17th and 18th centuries, the Portuguese carried most of the East African ivory, which was marketed in India, while the Indian cloth and beads were sold in East and West Africa by the Portuguese, Dutch, English, and French. The same applied to cowrie shells from the East Indies. Therefore, by control of the seas, Europe took the first steps towards transforming the several parts of Africa and Asia into economic satellites. When the Portuguese and the Spanish were still in command of a major sector of world trade in the first half of the 17th century, they engaged in buying cotton cloth in India to exchange for slaves in Africa, to mine gold in Central and South America. Part of the gold in the Americas would then be used to purchase spices and silks from the Far East. The concept of metropole and dependency automatically came into existence when parts of Africa were caught up in the web of international commerce. On the one hand, there were the European countries who decided on the role to be played by the African economy. And on the other hand, Africa formed an extension to the European capitalist market. As far as foreign trade was concerned, Africa was dependent on what Europeans were prepared to buy and sell. Europe exported to Africa goods which were already being produced and used in Europe itself. Dutch linen, Spanish iron, English pewter, Portuguese wines, French brandy, Venetian glass beads, German muskets, etc. Europeans were also able to unload on the African continent goods which had become unsellable in Europe. Thus, items like old sheets, cast-off uniforms, technologically outdated firearms, and lots of goods and ends found guaranteed markets in Africa. Africans slowly became aware of the possibility of demanding and obtaining better imported goods, and pressure was exerted on the captains of European ships. But the overall range of trade goods which left the European ports of Hamburg, Copenhagen, and Liverpool was determined almost exclusively by the pattern of production and consumption within Europe. From the beginning, Europe assumed the power to make decisions within the international trading system. An excellent illustration of that is the fact that the so-called international law, which governed the conduct of nations on the high seas, was nothing else but European law. Africans did not participate in its making, and in many instances, African people were simply the victims, for the law recognized them only as transportable merchandise. If the African slave was thrown overboard at sea, the only legal problem that arose was whether or not that slave ship could claim compensation for the insurers. Above all, European decision-making power was exercised in selecting what Africa should export in accordance with European needs. The ships of the Portuguese gave the search for gold the highest priority, particularly on the basis of well-known information that West African gold reached Europe across the Sahara, and partly on the basis of guesswork. The Portuguese were successful in obtaining gold in parts of West Africa and Eastern Central Africa. And it was the, quote, Gold Coast, which attracted the greatest attention from Europeans in the 16th and 17th centuries. The number of forts built there was proof to that effect, and the nations involved included the Scandinavians and the Prussians, today the Germans, apart from other colonial stalwarts like the British, Dutch, and Portuguese. Europeans were anxious to acquire gold in Africa because there was a pressing need for gold coin within the growing capitalist money economy. Since gold was limited to very small areas of Africa, as far as Europeans were then aware, the principal export was human beings. Only in very few places at given times was the export of another commodity of equal or greater importance. For example, in Senegal, there was gum, in Sierra Leone, camwood, in Mozambique, ivory. However, even after taking those things into account, one can say that Europe allocated to Africa the role of supplier of human captives to be used as slaves in various parts of the world. When Europeans reached the Americas, they recognized its enormous potential in gold and silver and tropical produce, but that potential could not be made a reality without adequate labor supplies. The indigenous Indian population could not withstand new European diseases such as smallpox, nor could they bear the organized toil of slave plantations and slave mines, having barely emerged from the hunting stage. That is why in islands like Cuba and Hispaniola, which is Haiti and the Dominican Republic, the local Indian population was virtually wiped out by the white invaders. At the same time, Europe itself had a very small population and could not afford to release the labor required to tap the wealth of the Americas. Therefore, they turned to the nearest continent, Africa, which incidentally had a population accustomed to settled agriculture and disciplined labor in many spheres. Those are the objective conditions lying behind the start of the European slave trade, and those are the reasons why the capitalist class in Europe used their control of international trade to ensure that Africa specialized in exporting captives. So we'll stop there. That was some really powerful words by Walter Rodney, chapter 3 of How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Comrade Erica, what do you think of that section?
Yeah, I think that section speaks to a lot of what Israel was speaking of about that sort of Saber Complex that people have in regards to Africa, right? Because we see Africa as this poor continent without really understanding why, or really understanding underdevelopment, right? And I think the book pushes back on the notion of developing countries, right? Because he argues that underdevelopment exists because of colonialism and European exploitation and imperialism, not so much of that these people were not a developed people. They were in fact developed. They were active in trade, but as you can see, they were also exploited. And then soon they were, they were taken over by a slave economy that just benefited Europe solely. So yeah, I think that I think that this speaks a lot to understanding the ways that wealth was obtained through European exploitation, understanding capitalism and racial capitalism especially. So yeah, that's my thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a good read. And shout out to Leon Friedrich, shout out to Orlando, Yamir, shout out to Yamir, to Infinita Salo, everybody that's watching and listening, James Graham. It's really powerful to see Walter Rodney talk about the economic foundations of Africa, because so much of this is carrying out today in terms of the global capitalist system. Comrade Ezra, what do you think about that last section?
Yeah, no, I also thought it was really powerful and really crucial into understanding capitalism and like capitalist development. Because, capitalism is about like constant growth, constant expansion. And they were able to do that, especially like Europe in like this amount of time, especially due to like what Walter Rodney was saying, its like biggest export were slaves and like human capital. And like that's really where they like were really extracting a lot of a lot of capital, a lot of profit out of that. And that's still something that like quite exists today. But you see like even, the slave trade and like taking that and like shipping slaves like everywhere, like here in Colombia, like there's like a really like heavy Afro-Indigenous population along the coast because of the slave trade there. And that's also where you see like higher like rates of like economic like poverty and like violence and other things. So I think it's like really crucial into understanding, like the development of capitalism, how it really relied upon like white supremacy. And I think it was like really powerful, definitely.
What about you, Nick?
Yeah, just piggying back off of that, one of the things I find interesting about this section and really throughout the whole book is how much of it still applies to today and the relationships that exist between Africa and the US and Western Europe today. He talks about how Europeans use the superiority of their ships and cannon to gain control of the coast of Africa. How can we think about that today? Well, the US is out there with their ships in almost every ocean, controlling not only the shores, but the international waters, applying U.S. international law instead of European law to sea trade. One of the ways the U.S. shows its superiority is through nuclear weapons, through an over-budgeted military force, which is in every continent. So a lot of those same things, especially when it comes to military imperialism, still exist today. Another interesting point he brings up is when he talks about how Europe was exporting goods that basically they were inflating the prices of. And by doing this, they were impoverishing many of the African nations and many of the African communities at the time. Again, this is still happening today. In fact, this is one of the main ways imperialism functions to this day, is that you have manufactured goods, consumer goods, which are coming from the global north, the first world, and going to places like Africa, places like Latin America and Asia, and they're being overpriced so that these rich countries can make money off of some goods that really aren't going to benefit the masses in Africa, right? They're really not going to benefit the majority of people because they're things like, expensive luxury cars that very few people are actually going to be able to buy or even use. They're all these expensive, overpriced goods that aren't necessary. So again, a lot of what he's talking about and describing in the 70s is very applicable to what's going on today. If you study the economies today, the same things are happening,
And even a lot of the terms, that's a great point. And even a lot of the terms in the capitalist economy today are based on that seafaring exploitation of Africa. Like, I'm glad we were talking about the role of ships and the role of sea commerce, because a lot of financial terms today, when we talk about banks, right? Like when we talk about what is a bank, like a river bank, water flows through a river bank and banks control the flow of money or revenue, which the prefix is also related to rev or river or stream. And so there's a lot of, in European capitalism, they equate capital and money and gold with water, which really shows kind of the demented nature of it, where they're saying like this gold is just as valuable as water. And it's all based on African underdevelopment. But Comrade Eric, I think you were going to make a point as well.
Yeah, Nick touched up on some really interesting points about those connections that still exist from then to now, but then also not just the military bases that that exist globally, but the way that we're occupied here. I think that is also significant. And then also when you talked about the banks, when they talked about the slaves, when they, their biggest concern being whether or not one that goes overboard will be insured. That's still a matter that we're fighting for today in regards to reparations, and the reparations struggle, how all that is connected. But then, when we again talk about underdevelopment, Rodney talks about development being what community, I think he said economic, community, and individual development. But then the argument could also be made that underdevelopment was related to anything other than comparing economies, then the U.S. would be an underdeveloped nation because of the way of its practices and the external oppression that it exhibits. So those are just some other points, because I think that Nick and Ezra made some, as they were talking, I was like, oh yeah.
Yeah, that's true. And we could apply it to the U.S. in so many ways, because, for example, New Orleans was the most important port during the 1800s in the U.S. And guess where a lot of things were going in and out of there? Enslaved people, enslaved Africans who were being sent all over the Americas. And although there's so much history of oppression of African people in the Americas, it's also inspiring to see how this colonial system has created solidarity and unity. For example, the Haitian Revolution of 1804, shortly after the revolution, there were huge uprisings in Louisiana, especially around the area of New Orleans. If you look up the 1811 quote unquote German Coast Uprising and other uprisings in that area, and what is today Alabama, Mississippi, there were Africans who were inspired by the Haitian Revolution and wanted to seize the means of production, wanted to seize New Orleans and take it for a new system. And it's really inspiring to see that as well historically. And so I'm glad that we're connecting it back with the United States. Shout out to James Graham. He said, when they came, we had the land and they had the Bible. Now we got the Bible and they got the land. Yeah, that's one of my favorite slogans that really encapsulates the crazy aspect of colonialism, that it's literally a psychological element as well, where they use media, their technology, to convince us that we're somehow inferior, even though we're the ones producing wealth, producing labor. Shout out to Andre and Thomas, Oklahoma. We're going to jump right into chapter 4 of How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. This is section 4.1, the European slave trade as a basic factor in African underdevelopment. Walter Rodney says, quote, to discuss trade between Africans and Europeans in the 4 centuries before colonial rule is virtually to discuss slave trade. Strictly speaking, the African only became a slave when he reached a society where he worked as a slave. Before that, he was first a free man and then a captive. Nevertheless, it is acceptable to talk about the trade in slaves to refer to the shipment of captives from Africa to various other parts of the world where they were to live and work as the property of Europeans. The title of this section is deliberately chosen to call attention to the fact that the shipments were all by Europeans to markets controlled by Europeans. And this was in the interest of European capitalism and nothing else. In East Africa and the Sudan, many Africans were taken by Arabs and were sold to Arab buyers. This is known in European books as the quote-unquote Arab slave trade. Therefore, let it be clear that when Europeans shipped Africans to European buyers, it was quote-unquote the European slave trade from Africa. Undoubtedly, with few exceptions such as Hawkins, European buyers purchased African captives on the coast of Africa, and the transaction between themselves and Africans was a form of trade. It is also true that very often a captive was sold and resold as he made his way from the interior to the port of embarkation, and that too was a form of trade. However, on the whole, the process by which captives were obtained on African soil was not trade at all. It was through warfare, trickery, banditry, and kidnapping. When one tries to measure the effect of European slave trading on the African continent, it is very essential to realize that one is measuring the effect of social violence rather than trade in any normal sense of the word. Many things remain uncertain about the slave trade and its consequences for Africa, but the general picture of destructiveness is clear, and that destructiveness can be shown to be the logical consequence of the manner of recruitment of captives in Africa. One of the uncertainties concerns the basic question of how many Africans were imported. This has long been an object of speculation, with estimates ranging from a few millions to over 100 million. A recent study has suggested a figure of about 10 million Africans landed alive in the Americas, the Atlantic islands, and Europe. Because it is a low figure, it is already being used by European scholars who are apologists for the capitalist system and its long record of brutality in Europe and abroad. In order to whitewash the European slave trade, they find it convenient to start by minimizing the numbers concerned. The truth is that any figure of Africans imported into the Americas, which is narrowly based on the surviving records, is bound to be low, because there were so many people at the time who had a vested interest in smuggling slaves and withholding data. Nevertheless, if the low figure of 10 million was accepted as a basis for evaluating the impact of slaving on Africa as a whole, the conclusions that could legitimately be drawn would confound those who attempt to make light of the experience of the rape of Africans from 1445 to 1870. On any basic figure of Africans landed alive in the Americas, one would have to make several extensions, starting with a calculation to cover mortality and transshipment. The Atlantic crossing, or the quote-unquote Middle Passage, as it was called by European slavers, was notorious for the number of deaths incurred, averaging in the vicinity of 15% to 20%. There were also numerous deaths in Africa between time of capture and time of embarkation, especially in cases where captives had to travel hundreds of miles to the coast. Most important of all, given that warfare was the principal means of obtaining captives, it is necessary to make some estimate as to the number of people killed and injured so as to extract the millions who were taken alive and sound. The resultant figure would be many times the millions landed alive outside of Africa, and it is that figure which represents the number of Africans directly removed from the population and labor force of Africa because of the establishment of slave production by Europeans. The massive loss to the African labor force was made more critical because it was composed of able-bodied young men and women. Slave buyers preferred their victims between the ages of 15 and 35, and preferably in the early 20s, the sex ratio being about 2 men to 1 woman. Europeans often accepted younger African children, but rarely any older person. They shipped the most healthy wherever possible, taking the trouble to get those who had already survived an attack of smallpox and who were therefore immune from further attacks of that disease, which was then one of the world's great killer diseases. Absence of data about the size of Africa's population in the 15th century makes it difficult to carry out any scientific assessment of the results of the population outflow, but nothing suggests that there was any increase in the continent's population over the centuries of slaving, although that was a trend in other parts of the world. Obviously, fewer babies were born than would otherwise have been the case if millions of childbearing ages were not eliminated. Besides, it is essential to recognize that the slave trade across the Atlantic Ocean was not the only connection which Europeans had with slaving in Africa. The slave trade on the Indian Ocean has been called the, quote, East African slave trade and the, quote, Arab slave trade for so long that it hides the extent to which it was also a European slave trade. When the slave trade from East Africa was at its height in the 18th century and the early 19th century, the destination of most captives was the European-owned plantation economies of Mauritius, Réunion, and Seychelles, as well as the Americas, via the Cape of Good Hope. Besides, Africans laboring as slaves in certain Arab countries in the 18th and 19th centuries were all ultimately serving the European capitalist system, which set up a demand for slave-grown products such as the cloves grown Zanzibar under the supervision of Arab masters. No one has been able to come up with a figure representing total losses to the African population sustained through the extraction of slave labor from all areas to all destinations over the many centuries that slave trade existed. However, on every other continent from the 15th century onwards, the population showed constant and sometimes spectacular natural increase, while it is striking that the same did not apply to Africa. And here he gives some statistics on the population increase and decrease around the world. Really powerful section, again, from How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Comrade Erica, what would you think of that part?
Yeah, in this chapter, he gives like a more detailed point of view of what the slave trade was, just based on how it was a basic factor of underdevelopment and the ways that it played out, and sort of the distortion of the African economy that already existed. And I think, again, he emphasizes here that, Africa was indeed developed. And that's what underdevelopment is. It's that sort of exploitation of what they were doing. And a lot of that, the ways, I think, again, this just gives more of a detailed explanation of racial capitalism and slavery as a capitalist system that I don't think you find anywhere else with such specific details, especially since the ways that he talks about the development of Africa before Europeans, or of the development of feudalism once they were introduced to the continent. So I think that he says so much in this one chapter that as you read, but again, I think the beauty of Walter Rodney is that it's clear. It's not a difficult language to understand. It's very, very clear language that he uses to pretty much break down a lot of myths, I want to say, that we have, especially around the Arab slave trade, right? Because I do appreciate that he points out that a lot of the conversation around the Arab slave trade serves as a cover to not really focus on the ones who did the most detriment. Like, sure, the Arab slave trade happened and the East Asian slave trade happened, but as a detrimental factor to the African continent, no, not anywhere near as significant as the Portuguese and the Dutch and the UK. Anywhere near as significant. So I do like that he highlights that. But again, the beauty of Walter Rodney for me, in all of his books that I've read, is that I don't like to use accessible language, but I do like the idea that it's easy concepts that people can struggle with and against when they read it.
Yeah, that's a great point, especially about the demystification of the quote Arab slave trade. That's an argument a lot of white libertarians in the US use against reparations. We support reparations. We believe that if there were ever to be any form of socialism on the quote unquote United States, first of all, the United States wouldn't even exist as a country anymore because it's a colonial settler construct. But B, reparations has to be front and center. That has to be number one, because there's so much wealth in the United States and Europe that's based on the exploitation of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And how are we going to go about and distribute that wealth without even first addressing, wait a second, like this is all stolen value. This is all stolen wealth from Africa, from our peoples. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because it's an argument that frequently gets brought up by a lot of right-wing white libertarians who are like, well, every society had slave trade. And what about the Arab slave trade? It's like, my dude, you ran that shit. You had the banks that controlled that shit. Like, y'all were running it. And I'm glad that he kind of like was going in on the people who said that in that chapter. But Comrade Ezra, what'd you think about that section?
Excuse me. Yeah, no, I thought it was really good. There was like one part I thought particularly that was maybe not interesting, but when he was like talking about, like when they would like take slaves, and like especially like certain like Europeans really like to take like African like children. So it kind of reminds me of this. I mean, there's still kind of this attitude you see a lot today, right? You see like celebrities going to Africa, and it's always just like Africa, like, yes, Africa, like where in Africa? It's a continent, but I'm going to Africa to do charity work, to work with the poor orphan children, to adopt a child there. It's like, there are children in America that you could also be helping. It's like this weird kind of like, I don't know, but there's definitely, I don't want to say fetishization, but yeah, something about like Africa going to save them, especially with the children. So it's like interesting that he like touched on this. It's definitely a very colonial attitude we really see prevalent even today. And even talking about how, now like countries were like producing things specifically for like the colonial core, like certain, industries, certain resources were being created just for that. And yeah, it's about like this complete control of like the economy, where like they're using the land to produce things for like the colony, like for the colonial core, rather than for the people there, to support the people there. So it's just like taking control of everything, every aspect, controlling the land, the resources, where it's going, the economy, just like the total control, and how that led to the underdevelopment, and how, yeah, we just have the life we have in the global north because of the exploitation of like the global south, and we're just seeing concrete examples of it here.
Yeah, most definitely. Shout out to Comrade Genaro, Ayala, and Anayansi. Nick, what'd you think of that last section? Very powerful.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. He talks about the stealing of the labor power of Africa, and I think that often goes overlooked, because what makes value, what makes resources, what creates the wealth for the rich, for the imperial countries, is that labor, right? Labor is what creates wealth. And that's exactly what they were doing in what the Europeans did when they went to Africa. Was they dehumanized the African people. They no longer saw them as humans, and they treated them the same. They did the same with the indigenous here in the Americas, but they no longer saw them as human. They saw them as commodities to be taken at will, against their will, to be sold, to be bought. I mean, it was a complete, and there's a psychological aspect that goes along with this, and that leaves generations of trauma and generations of just sort of psychological torture on those who have ancestors who were part of this, who were forcibly taken, who were bought and sold. And I think he starts touching on that in this part. He starts talking about, well, these were. And if you read the book, from especially the first 2 chapters, you'll see that he's describing all the different cultures and the nations that already existed in Africa that, like Comrade Erica said, were developed, right? And there were some of them were actually more developed than many of the societies in Europe. And they, by going in there and treating them not like humans, right, dehumanizing them, well, then you take away all of the autonomy, all of the power that comes with all of the rights, the innate human rights that really everyone is inherited to, everyone deserves, right? And I think that's important to highlight, because a lot of people a lot of people overlook that aspect. They overlook the fact that Africa was a nation with professionals, with people who knew how to create new technologies, were on the cusp of advancing their societies, but they were ripped out of their homeland. They were ripped out of their nations and their communities, and brought somewhere else to do work which was not at all what they wanted to do. Not at all work that was meant for any human to do. I think that's important that he starts talking about that, because that labor power. I always think about this whenever I read this, but imagine if a lot of those communities in Africa were able to develop without European intervention. Imagine what the oil people would be like today if there was no Europeans stealing from them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely.
That makes me think of brain drain, and what Caribbean and Latin American and Africa too is dealing with. The best of the people there being taken away and then going on to live in the West to benefit the West and not their countries. And Ajamu Umi of All African People's Revolutionary Party, he just recently did a webinar about like African technologies and how the exploitation of it currently, with our Apple phones and items and such, and just that current lawsuit that's happening with the Congo children. He was talking about just the significance of African technologies, and if it were to, again, as a reparations matter, if it was all to be given back to the continent, how significantly advanced we would be, and not seen as poor continent that needs help and saviorship. It's more than that.
It's taking back what's rightfully the property or the resources of the African people. That's a great point, Comrade Erica. And I know we're running a little short on time. Shout out to everybody watching and listening, by the way. So maybe I'll just read a short excerpt from chapter 5, maybe some last thoughts, and we can just wrap up there, because I know Comrade Erica has to go to also another discussion. So I'll just quickly read from chapter 5, Africa's contribution to the capitalist development of Europe, the colonial period. And he starts off by talking about capital and African wage labor. Colonial Africa fell within that part of the international capitalist economy from which surplus was drawn to feed the metropolitan sector. As seen earlier, exploitation of land and labor is essential for human social advance, but only on the assumption that the product is made available within the area where the exploitation takes place. Colonialism was not merely a system of exploitation, but one whose essential purpose was to repatriate the profits to the so-called mother country. From an African viewpoint, that amounted to consistent expatriation of surplus produced by African labor out of African resources. It meant the development of Europe as part of the same dialectical process in which Africa was underdeveloped. By any standards, labor was cheap in Africa, and the amount of surplus extracted from the African laborer was great. The employer under colonialism paid an extremely small wage, a wage usually insufficient to keep the worker physically alive, and therefore he had to grow food to survive. This applied in particular to farm labor of the plantation type, to work in mines, and to certain forms of urban employment. At the time of the imposition of European colonial rule, Africans were able to gain a livelihood from the land. Many retained some contact with the land in the years ahead, and they worked away from their shambas in order to pay taxes or because they were forced to do so. After feudalism in Europe had ended, the worker had absolutely no means of sustenance other than through the sale of his labor to capitalists. Therefore, to some extent, the employer was responsible for ensuring the physical survival of the worker by giving him a, quote, living wage. In Africa, this was not the case. Europeans offered the lowest possible wage and relied on legislation backed by force to do the rest. There were several reasons why the African worker was more crudely exploited than his European counterpart in the present century. Firstly, the alien colonial state had a monopoly of political power after crushing all opposition by armed force. Secondly, the African working class was small, very dispersed, and very unstable owing to migratory practices. Thirdly, while capitalism was willing to exploit all workers everywhere, European capitalists in Africa had additional racial justifications for dealing unjustly with the African worker. The racist theory that the black man was inferior led to the conclusion that he deserved lower wages. And interestingly enough, the light-skinned Arab and Berber populations of North Africa were treated as, quote, blacks by the white racist French. The combination of the above factors in turn made it extremely difficult for African workers to organize themselves. It is only the organization and resoluteness of the working class which protects it from the natural tendency of the capitalists to exploit to the utmost. That is why in all colonial territories, when African workers realized the necessity for trade union solidarity, numerous obstacles were laid in their paths by the colonial regimes. Wages paid to workers in Europe and North America were much higher than wages paid to African workers in comparable categories. The Nigerian coal miner at Enugu earned $1 a day for working underground and 9 cents a day for jobs on the surface. Such a miserable wage would be beyond comprehension of a Scottish or German coal miner who could virtually earn in an hour what the Enugu miner was paid for a 6-day week. The same disparity existed with port workers. The records of the large American shipping company Faro Lines showed that in 1955, of the total amount spent on loading and discharging cargo moving between Africa and America, 5/6 went to American workers and 1/6 went to Africans. Yet it was the same amount of cargo loaded and unloaded at both ends. The wages paid to the American stevedore and the European coal miners were still such as to ensure that the capitalists made a profit. The point here is merely to illustrate how much greater was the rate of exploitation of African miners. So we'll stop here. This is a really important point, the rate of exploitation of African miners. Here, Rodney's giving a scientific and economic explanation for the exploitation of African workers. Eric, I know you have to bounce, so I'll give you the last word, and maybe afterward, me and Comrade Ezra and Nick can keep discussing. But what do you think, Erica?
Yeah, I think that in this chapter, especially, he highlights the contradictions between the European working class and the African workers. But more importantly, I think that there's a deeper, more clarity on colonialism as not just merely being like a system exploitation, but something that is advanced to advance the mother country. Yeah, and I think that the significance of this book, again, when we read it, it was very useful for the AFRICOM campaign, but I think more than that, it was very useful for how we understand the reparations argument, because following that, I was able to read Workers' World Party. They have a Marxism, reparations, and the African world, I believe is the name of the title of the book. But yeah, because I think that the focus, where we're seeing there's some sort of drift or some sort of break in how we're understanding reparations is not just a global matter, but specific to specific people. And this book sort of highlights not only Walter Rodney's stance that we are African people, but why and how, and the connections. And, you know, especially in the previous chapter where he talks about how many, you know, the amount of Africans that were taken from the continent, we would never know for sure because of the way records were held. But we know it was a lot of, it was enough of them, and the way that the trade happened in the Caribbean and the mainland that was continuous after they left Africa. So I think that this book is important to understand Africa and to understand settler colonialism, especially. And I think that Walter Rodney does such a great job at breaking down racism, not racism, but capitalism as it pertains to slavery, and helping making that argument for reparations a lot stronger. And I do want to thank you, Ramiro, for inviting me to have this conversation with the limited time that I did have tonight.
Nah, it's all good. We had to have you on. We love having you on, Erica. It's always great to speak with you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks, Erica.
Peace out, Erica. Yeah, that was Erica Caines, poet, writer, organizer in Baltimore and DMV area. Make sure to go and follow Liberation Through Reading, Ujima People's Progress Party. She has some really dope content. But just to kind of finish talking about Walter Rodney with comrades Nick and Ezra, maybe, Nick, we can start off with you. What'd you think of that last section that we read?
I think, well, I think one point that Comrade Erica made right before she left, I thought was really good was, you know, Rodney's pointing out how a lot of this colonialism it's meant to force nations in the global South and the third world to produce goods and advance the imperialist nations, you know, the core nations. This isn't just to make certain capitalists in the rich countries richer. This is to advance the whole society and the whole nations of the core countries of Western Europe. This is how Western Europe became rich. You know, people talk about, Europe, how beautiful Europe is. You travel to Europe and you see all this development, you know, all of these very industrialized towns and cities, and you same thing in much of the United States. All of that was premised off of violent, brutal colonization, which is where they got their wealth from, right? And it was a combination of the colonialism within Africa, the slave trade within Africa, and the extermination of the indigenous in Latin America, in all of the Americas, right? These two things allowed for countries to basically pave their roads in gold, the gold that was stolen from the Americas through slaves who were forced to work in the mines. I mean, this is the history that he's talking about. And, you know, this chapter 5 is my favorite chapter because it just talks about, it really breaks down the economic aspects of all of these differences. And I think it's really telling. It's just really telling just the fact that he's talking about in these colonial states, there's a difference between the European worker and the African worker. Now compare that today to the international European workers and the workers in Africa, where a lot of places are still using child slavery. A lot of Western corporations, European corporations are still using child slavery in Africa, right? But that would never happen anywhere here in Western Europe or the United States. So, you know, a lot of what he's saying, again, I want to just bring this up, point out, a lot of what he's saying still applies today, and we gotta make those connections.
It's a great point, Nick. And Comrade Ezra.
Yeah, well, just like how it is super relevant, everything he says today. And I think with a lot of these like revolutionary writers, particularly like these Black revolutionary writers like Walter Rodney, like Frantz Fanon, a lot of what they say, particularly in regards to colonialism, it's like still relevant, much still hasn't changed. And yeah, I think this point about like imperialism and how, yeah, the countries in the global north have been able to like build these these great cities, build these lives from this exploitation. I mean, in an earlier chapter, he even mentions the Nordic countries. And like, especially, the Nordic countries are talked about like, oh, we don't want communism, socialism. We want like the Nordic countries. I'm like, okay, so you want imperialism and exploitation of the global south. So like, that's what it's based off of. So I think that's like really important to acknowledge, like that's like not what we want. Like we won't have liberation until we have liberation for all. And like anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism are two like really important things to really express solidarity with those in the global south, with those in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, all throughout the world. So we really need, because yeah, as we said, like the condition for the worker in the global now, like north versus the global south, there's this like global division of like the worker and the working class. And it's so much easier to exploit the worker in the global south to like take advantage of that and like these systems they put in place, like with transnational corporations. France still continues to collect a colonial tax from 13 African countries. Like colonialism never ended, it's just rebranded itself. So it is really important, I think, to understand, because it helps us understand Africa, how it is now, and like where we need to go in the future to really like fight against this, which is the capitalist imperialist system.
That's a good way of putting it. It never went away, it just rebranded itself. That's exactly right. And what I like about Walter Rodney, especially in that chapter, and overall in how Europe underdeveloped Africa, is just how Marxist and dialectical he is in explaining concepts, which I think doesn't get as much attention. I think he raises a really good concept, which is this idea of core and periphery, which is a concept that as third worldist communists as well, we study and apply in terms of the global north and the global south, where we have the core, which is the US, Europe, Japan, some would say Australia, and the quote unquote state of Israel, and the global south, Asia, Africa, Latin America, where the economies of the periphery are centered completely around the core. And we can see different fractals of that in society. What do I mean by fractal? Where is that system of global imperialism that is based on colonialism, with the core and the periphery of Africa, Asia, and Latin America being the periphery, and the core being the US, Europe, and Australia, we can see reflected in the microcosm in a city. For example, I'm born and raised in New York. I grew up in Washington Heights in Uptown Manhattan, but also grew up in Jamaica, Queens, which is all the way on the eastern part of New York. Both of those neighborhoods are in the far extremities of New York City. And so every day when I would take the subway as a kid or just going to school, everybody who everybody who lived in my neighborhoods would commute to Manhattan. They would take the subway into Manhattan, which is like the core. That's where all the capital is. That's where the jobs are, the banks, the industry, the commerce. And the entire infrastructure of New York City was designed in a way that all these trains would go out into the periphery, into the hoods of New York, where Black and brown people lived, poor people lived, to create wealth in the core in Manhattan, to work in the stores, to sell products. And at the end of the day, they would always leave the core and go back into the periphery. And so like if you take the subway in New York, for example, for y'all who are watching and listening, you have probably seen this before, where like if you're in the train in like Midtown Manhattan, you see a lot of rich white people. You're like, okay, they probably live here, work here. Once you start going to the end of the cities, that's when you see Black and brown people, poor people, and that's the periphery. And so we can imagine that on the global scale. And I think Walter Rodney is beginning to introduce that. And I think it's an important concept because on the one hand, while we support global socialism, we support workers of all countries uniting, we also have to make a distinction that workers in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, especially in Africa, as Walter Rodney is pointing out here, make way less for the same amount of labor, the same types of labor carried out in the core. And I think that's a key distinction that many in the left, unfortunately, don't understand or value. But what do y'all think about that? Maybe Comrade Ezra.
Yeah, well, just in general about like wages.
Yeah, or just like that core periphery kind of dynamic.
Oh, the core, well, yeah, with the wages, but also the core periphery. Because yeah, this is something we notice like we can like notice it in like the like bigger scale. Like we have the core countries, the periphery countries, but even like the colonial system, when they went into like these African countries, you know, there was like a core periphery there as well. They had the core where, you know, that's where like the colonists live, that's where certain workers live, that's where they would build the hospitals, that's where they would build certain things. But then like out towards the periphery, not as much. Even like with laborers, like they would have laborers working these jobs that were quite dangerous, but they wouldn't give them access to education for, you know, their kids, or they wouldn't give them access as much to like medical care, or yeah, lots of just like human rights violations that were okay. And a lot of this was based off of like white supremacy, the way they thought that they could treat them, the way they like looked at them as commodities, not necessarily people. So yeah, this like core periphery concept, it's like development where it's like convenient for them and where it benefits them. But yeah, it's like about keeping this separate. And yeah, the core periphery thing, even here in Colombia, you see it like in Bogota, like the poor people live like way far out in the city and have to take, you know, the bus in like 2.5 hours, and they only come in to work, specifically to work for like the richer people. And this is just something we see duplicated all over, I think, the global South.
Yeah. What about you, Nick?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything y'all said. I never thought of like, you know, I've been living in like the tri-state area for my whole life. I never really thought of New York City that way, as a core and periphery within itself. It's usually, you know, whenever I think of cores, peripheries, I think of the core being the metropole, the city, and the periphery being the countryside. But even within these cities themselves, they contain cores and peripheries where capital is centered in one area. So I think that's interesting. And, you know, it's interesting, too, that when we talk about the cores and peripheries, I always bring it back to the international scale. And I always think about, too, a writing from Lin Biao, where he talks about how, if we think about internationally how the world works, there is a metropole, there is a city center. And that city center is in the West. It's Western Europe. It's the United States. It's the imperialists, all the imperialist countries. And, you know, all of the outskirts of the city center are, you know, Latin America, Africa, Asia, all of the places where all of these resources, all of the labor power comes from. And that's really, you know, if we want to begin thinking about imperialism, or if we even want to begin calling ourselves anti-imperialist, we have to start with this notion of, well, we're combating the system which has been set up, which sets the Western European and in the US and all these imperialist countries as the city center, and everything else is the outskirts, where they just draw resources for those who live in the core area. I think that's so important to think about, especially when we consider ourselves and talking about anti-imperialism and thinking about, well, what do we got to do next, right? Because then that starts aligning with some of the solutions we have, which are like, well, you got to start delinking from the core and creating your own independent areas, right? I like what Comrade Ezra said about, you know, even in colonized countries, you have areas that are created to be core areas where the colonists live, right, where the settlers live, because, you know, you think about it that way. What they did, what these colonizers did when they went into Africa, Latin America, and Asia is they developed the country. They built railroads, but they built railroads in ways that would only benefit the major population centers that they were colonized, that they were living in, that these Europeans were going to live in, right? They were building trains, but these trains weren't going like to benefit the people. It wasn't infrastructure to benefit the people. It was infrastructure made so that they can make a profit off of it, right? It was built to get resources from one place to the port, so that they can then make money from it for their companies. And, you know, our goal is not to just build build infrastructure for the sake of creating profit. It's to build infrastructure for the sake of, you know, uniting communities, making it easier for workers to go from one place to the other, to see their families, to go to work, right? To actually go shopping and be connected with the outside world. That's really, you know, I think that's when we talk about core and periphery and what we understand as solutions later on. That's what solutions look like. They look like delinking from this profit motive, which was ingrained since colonialism, right? As Walter Rodney shows us, and creating societies where we can build infrastructure that it's for the people, that's not for the profit, right?
Yeah, that's a great point, Comrade Nick. And I think that's a great point to wrap up on. Shout out to Comrade Yamir. You comrades maybe want to get the book now, LOL. Yo, it's a really good book. It's online, PDF for people who can't afford it, but I think I highly suggest getting the book just also to get the word out about Walter Rodney. One of the figures I didn't mention earlier who played an important role in publishing the book is a woman by the name of Andai, who was a Guyanese Black feminist, organizer, revolutionary. She passed away 2 years ago, I think. She doesn't get enough credit for her role. I think she actually edited the book. So I just want to give a shout out to her and her family because they also played a role. And it's just important to uplift in general our revolutionaries from Nuestra America, from our countries, because they don't get enough attention. And I think Walter Rodney today, like what he was getting at, in the same way that Lin Biao and Kim Il-sung were beginning the foundation, and even Che Guevara as well, were beginning the foundations of third worldist communism, of global anti-imperialism. I think Walter Rodney was also hinting at that as well. And it's important for us to rescue that. Also others like Roy Mauro Marini and others in the dependency theory field of politics. But it's been really great to speak with you all, comrades. Again, this was Political Education Session number 12, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney. We'll put a link to the PDF in the description afterwards if y'all want to read it. Shout out to everybody in the chat, Ramiro, Shaka, Balagun, to Yamir, to John Rivera, to Anayansi, to everybody watching and listening. This is ANTICONQUISTA, Anti-Imperialist Media Collective, producing content by and for the Latin American and Caribbean diaspora. Make sure if you want to be part of that movement that Nick is talking about us in the core, in the global core of imperialism, go and support our Patreon, patreon.com/ANTICONQUISTA. We're actively raising and sending funds for revolutionary groups in Latin America and the Caribbean. That's so essential to our work. We're not just talking about it, we're actually doing it. So we'll put a link to that as well. Peace out, everybody. Have a great day and take care, y'all. Peace out, Nick and Comrade Ezra.
Peace.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Peace out, y'all.